So far, we have been looking at the vector space Rn only algebraically, but R2 is often depicted by a two-dimensional plane. You basically have two number lines that are perpendicular. The horizontal one is called the x1 axis, and the vertical one is called the x2 axis. Every element of R2 can be represented by a point on this plane as follows. Say we're looking at u equals -1, 3. What you do first is, you look at the x1 component, which is -1, and you draw a vertical line that crosses -1 on the x1 axis. And then you look at the x2 component, in this case is 3, and you draw a horizontal line that crosses the x2 axis at 3. The intersection of these lines is the point representing the tuple -1, 3. The point at which the x1 and x2 axes cross is called the origin, and it represents the tuple 0, 0. This setup, with tuples represented as points on the plane, forms the basis for coordinate geometry. But in the context of vector spaces, vectors are normally represented as arrows rather than points. For example, if we treat u as a vector, then we will draw an arrow from the origin to the point that represents the tuple. And if v is the vector 2, -1, then v is represented by this arrow. Using these arrows, we can work with the vector space R2 purely geometrically. For that, we need to know how to add two vectors geometrically and how to take a scalar multiple of a vector geometrically. To obtain u plus v, you simply slide the arrow representing v such that its tail coincides with the head of the arrow representing u. Then, the arrow from the origin to the head of the slided arrow will represent u plus v. To multiply u by a scalar alpha, if alpha is non-negative, you draw an arrow starting at the origin, pointing in the same direction as u, but with length alpha times the length of u. So if I want to draw 1/2 u, I just look at the arrow for u and draw an arrow 1/2 its length starting at the origin. If alpha is negative, you will need to flip the direction. Suppose that I want to draw -u. I simply draw an arrow in the opposite direction of u, having the same length as u.